Served Rowan did nights because nights made sense. Machines took their turns speaking and people mostly slept. He knew the hospital by its noises, the warmer soft door hiss when nurses slid towels in, the medication fridge with its fat, contented hum, the distant osteolab's compressor clicking awake and counting to 10 before it settled again. In the oncology wing, footsteps softened to felt. On the atrium floor, a mild ocean lived behind glass for the children who came for scans and blood draws. Someone had convinced donations loose from a foundation years ago. The display tank pulsed a slow blue even when moonlights were off, coral plates overlapping like stacked dishes in a careful cupboard. He clocked in without looking at the time card, tapped the custodial badge to the reader, and checked the board. Names were written in a neat hand he could identify by the way the SAS leaned forward, as if walking. Emily K. Single room, oncology, neutropenic precautions. He had seen her only from the doorway, a thin arm with purple bruises from failed draws. A sleeve of her robe lifted as she tried to thread hair that no longer existed behind an ear, still somehow elegant. At night, she watched the ceiling, as if the lights hid something. He didn't clean inside isolation rooms. He wheeled the cart to the threshold and waited for a nurse to hand over a sealed bag of trash. Then he marked a box and moved down the hall. The hospital warmed with people during day shift and chilled during nights, not in temperature but in mood, as if light itself hummed louder when there were more voices. In the countdown to midnight, he checked the display tank. A small handheld on the shelf beside it displayed readings he had learned by memory, if not by heart. ORP, oxidation reduction potential, made a neat line like a heartbeat drawn flat. If it skittered, you chased the cause. Skimmer pump throughput, dose feed, a protein film choking the surface. He had learned to lean in until the glass cooled his breath, as if that small discomfort earned a right to see if the water was clear. The labeler on the shelf fed a blank strip like a tongue. He hadn't pressed the button. Tape greedily peeled itself, warm from use even though the case was cold. The letters were his appointment with the joke. Do not greet. He peeled the strip fully and held it up. Old block caps. The lab hands used them when they labeled vials, that hard, linear, pencil-in-the-air script that outlasted shake. He stuck the tape to the side of the handheld, where it wouldn't bother anyone. Moonlights were off, but a dull glow moved through the coral like someone carrying a coat. He touched the glass. On the inside of the pane, 5 ovals and a thumb appeared at child height, pressed and lifted slowly, the print drying from the edges in. It was a trick of condensation, he thought, a memory of somebody earlier in the day. He set his hand opposite despite the absurdity. The glass matched his heat, palm to palm, a second hand through a wall. He waited until it cooled. Nothing else happened, and the thing in him that had tensed, the part that worked with buckets and drains and schedules, unclenched. At 0312, the return pump eased higher by 1%. He could hear it because he knew where to listen. The surface fell, rose, as if a wet foot had stepped down a rung of invisible stairs and then off again. The school opened a lane, then closed, unalarmed. The feed bar clicked a single pellet that did not fall. The handheld printed a log line the firmware didn't own. Served. He blinked, looked for the little circle that indicated a software update. Under the line, the touchscreen redrew the system and added a ghost loop labeled home, then blinked and forgot. Floor salt glittered by the concrete drain as if a wet heel had stood there and dried. He said nothing to the security guard who made his first round out of habit or courtesy. He told himself the tape was a prank from day shift. He told himself condensation was condensation. The brain would pour pictures into any container at night. The oncology wing had a different smell. When you watched this long, you named them to yourself to blunt their edges. Bleach diluted to a sweetness like a counterfeit fruit. Skin lotion with its gentle chemical lily. The faint rust of iron when a bag leaked and someone caught it with a towel. In isolation rooms, air moved differently because it had its own doors to pass through in the walls, pulled and pushed through filters the size of tabletops. The ceiling in those rooms whispered. You couldn't mistake it for wind. Filters talked in a bright whisper, as if sand were a language and it had learned to spell the word clean. Rowan pushed his cart with one hand, the other hooked into a rag's hem by habit, and he moved down the oncology hall toward the closed door with Emily S. name on the placard. A nurse stood at the window with a tablet and thumbed orders, then looked at him without smiling. Nights had their own economy of faces. Smiles were like bonuses, not guaranteed. He raised his hand in a little wave that wasn't a wave. The tape strip on his handheld tugged at his attention. Do not greet. He hid the handheld behind his hip, ashamed of his own mind. He worked until 04 Psi, then sat on the break room chair by the vending machine, watching the spiral wire hold a paper cone cup hostage. The microwave had a note on it that said, "No fish." Someone had drawn a cartoon fish with big eyelashes and a worried expression. The refrigerator with its glass door hummed with the mild authority of machines that measured themselves against heat and won. In his pocket, the handheld nudged once with a new notification, then went quiet. He left it there, as if ignoring would starve whatever part of the night wanted his participation. The second night, the labeler printed tape when he wheeled past the atrium on his way to mop the east stairwell. Do not greet. The tape fed itself as if it had been told to. He thought of the oncology nurse's elbow dents on the counter, always in the same place. People worked out patterns for comfort and then gave those patterns away by accident. He ripped the tape off and stuck it to the underside of the shelf where it couldn't look at him. He mopped, and the mop left dark arcs that dried to paler arcs. The stairwell sobbed a little when the door closed. He liked the stairwell. It was bare truth, concrete, paint, the enamel smoothness of railings that cooled your palm, a bulb that hummed, the heat of the day still nested in the walls. Scrapes on the landing made a kind of history, but not his. He thought about the handprint inside the glass until he didn't. It was either a thing or it wasn't. If it was, then it would come back without his thinking helping or hurting it. If it wasn't, then he had given a trick the honor of his attention. In oncology, Emily's door was open before he got there. Her voice came out quiet as an instruction given to a child who is half asleep. "I can hear water," she said, to no one in particular. The nurse inside said, "That's your air." The nurse S tone walked the fine line between soft and brisk they taught you after 3 months on night shift, when empathy had to be measured or it would pour you out hollow by dawn. Rowan stood outside the threshold and looked at the floor so he wouldn't be curious about the person to whom the voice belonged. The isolation sign told him where to stand. The bag of trash came out sealed, the nurse's gloved hand holding it by the twisted neck. He took it, nodded thanks. The nurse said, "We're discouraging visitors for her tonight," quietly, without looking up from the tablet. "There's a community ad in effect for immunosuppressed. Some water advisories too, cities dealing with an inline thing. Boil notice for some neighborhoods." The hospital had a way of caging the world's problems in paperwork, but Boyle notices moved like weather. The fact of them made the building draw in. Water fountains wore blue bags. Break room sinks asked you not to drink them, please. Someone ran hoses from a safe tap in the basement to the pediatric wing to make coffee. He didn't mention the aquarium. He had nothing to mention. He took the bag to the cart and wrote the number of the room on the sheet with its boxes. He imagined water moving through pipes, past joints and valves and branchings the way veins threaded a forearm. He thought of someone stepping into a stream and out again on a bank he could not see. The tank's handheld showed a neat ORP line until it didn't. Little hills rose like knuckles beneath a cloth. He leaned close and watched the numbers tick, thought of rain hammered into the sea, and what rain meant, a change in what the water was, not in where it went. He placed the palm of his hand on the glass to feel if the temperature wanted to tell him a story again. He had never believed anything like stories, but night made storied animals out of machines. This time the glass registered him as nothing. He left his hand until the heel ached. He dreamed the sleep of a day worker off their schedule, a sleep that sliced itself into careful pieces. In one, he was in the stairwell with a mop, and when he pressed the mop down, the floor bowed like a membrane. Beneath it, something took a step and lifted the floor with it and set it down with exact politeness. He woke with the imprint of the mop handle in the soft of his palm, where the bark of the wooden rod had rubbed it a line that looked like a word if he stared until letters wanted to grow there. On the third night, Emily screamed once, and the hospital gates of sound let it through, but only in part, as if it were contraband noise. He dropped a bag into the bin, and the lid fell open and banged his shin, and he only knew there was pain later. First he knew the scream had not been an announcement of violence, but of dread. The nurse at the oncology desk shook her head once when he stopped, a small motion as if to say that tonight they needed fewer eyes, fewer bodies in the hallway. That presence multiplied fear. He nodded and became air. He visited the atrium to pretend the night made sense. The aquarium cards alphabetized with tidy facts, the kind that disguised the fear of an open mouth: clownfish, angelfish, goby. A child had stuck a sticker to the glass last week, and he had removed it carefully with a razor, fancying himself kind to a surface. The handheld showed ORP staircasing in neat steps, with times beside them, as if whatever had taken a foot down into the water had made it a habit. He touched the glass, and nothing touched back. The labeler made its own sound. The tape licked out this time and printed before he could stop it, letters forcing themselves out of the little square mouth. "Do not greet," it said, and then a second line. "Served." He took the cassette out for the first time and shook it. The strip of ink looked fine, the world's oldest solution. Shake it, reseat it, pretend this was normal. He laughed once, with air only, because the vending machine S-glass reflected his mouth, and he did not want to see it open. He spent a cleaning cycle working the oncology wing S East corridor by hand with a rag and a bottle, because the floor buffer had a loose foot. He knelt on his left knee, then on his right knee when the left would not hold him steady. The rag hissed where it met the baseboard. He passed the little oxygen ports set into the walls like coin slots sunken into enamel. He thought of air as a liquid for the first time. That was not a useful thought. He tried to abandon it and found it had his sleeve in its teeth. The nurse, who never smiled, stopped him by the desk with a hand lifted to shoulder height. "There's an advisory," she said. "We're shifting more to disposables. Laundry's staying full. If you can avoid the towel carts tonight, avoid them." Rowan looked past her as if at paperwork that existed. "Are you contaminated?" he asked without planning to, and then he flinched at his word choice. He could have said exposed. He could have said risk. He had said the year's ugliest word with its biblical rind. "We're fine," she said. "Please don't say things around the rooms. The walls are thin." Her eyes traveled down to the handheld at his belt, where the tape sat like a stuck leaf. "Do not greet." She clocked it, and her face, used to minimal expression for pragmatic reasons, refused to register curiosity. "What's that?" "A reminder," he said. "For me." He's the one who had stuck it there, so technically this wasn't truly untrue. He thought of all the greetings he performed in a shift, the little raised hand to a camera in case someone in security bothered to watch, the nodded morning to the morning that wasn't a morning yet at 05 Zam, when the sky barely remembered how to turn grey, the way he squared his shoulders to a locked door as if it could be charmed by posture. He wondered how many were defensive spells and how many were invitations. He walked into the stairwell, not to mop, but to listen. The hum of the fluorescent tubes combed the air. A woolly radio hiss from security downstairs wandered in through the vent. He breathed through his mouth because he had scrubbed the railings earlier, and the lemon of the wipe pretended to be oxygen, and it announced itself too well. A small sound, like a coin, dropped into water traveled up the shaft, and he stepped backward before he could think, as if space had to adjust while he decided. He kept cleaning. Bleach made the skin between his fingers sour. He rinsed, and the water felt wrong only because of the advisory the nurse had mentioned. His body believed signs. There were notices on the sinks now in layers like scales, each new sign taped over the last one, and if you pulled one away, you knew you would find the fossil of old notices beneath. Hand washing saves lives. Water interruption. Please limit hot water. On the fourth night, his hand looked wrong. He had been washing and the desert astringency of sanitizer lived in his knuckles. When he bent his thumb, the skin cracked along an old paint fleck scar, and at the bottom of the crack was a thin line of dark that wasn't blood. It was adhesive from the tape he had taken off the hand held earlier to stop looking at it. The sink water was double-bagged by notices tonight, a clear plastic hood on the faucet, as if they had put a raincoat on a mouth. He stood an extra second longer than he needed to, because hot water as a sensation did something to you no sign could unteach. He imagined the small hospital aliens of contamination, hairs, spores, skins, the diaspora of normal bodies. He imagined other things, because nights wrote drafts in a part of the brain unused by daylight. He imagined the inside of the aquarium glass cool and dry, and then wet again from the height of a child's hand, and how a hand could appear without the rest of the body that belonged to it, and how that could be a kindness. He stepped into the atrium and didn't turn the moonlights on. He had keys and the power to flash something pretty for himself. He left the tank in its own weather. The handheld's ORP line had taken to drawing itself into a stare again. Humble regularity, as if the system had discovered a way to breathe. He watched a pellet roll along the feed bar and stop at the lip, a paused thought. The log printed a word he could not rationalize. Home. It wrote it with the softness of a person who had decided to say only one word and to mean it completely. He pressed his palm to the glass because his body wanted him to. The panel was cool and then matched him. The water beyond did what all water does when asked to do a trick as a favor. It did nothing that could be admired. The life inside swam with minds appropriate to life that had never heard of hospitals or advisories or the word greet. They opened lanes and closed them without drama. He stayed until his palm ached again, because ached was still a human word that meant he was here, and not in a set of corridors where an unspooled roll of tape might be speaking. He wiped the underside of the shelf where he had hidden the printed tape the night before, because cleaning is reflex, and he would rather be seen than ambiguous to himself. His rag came away, tacky. He flicked the rag twice over the drain without thinking. A wet heel print flashed under the light and then evaporated, but left the floor salt bright in those grains that catch light the way a sneeze catches breath. He could pretend. He could pretend forever if the hospital offered him enough surfaces. By the fifth night, there were messages on the doors. A printed memo about the Boyle Notices extension. Social media screenshots where the city apologized to no one in particular for a service interruption it had not defined well. Reminders that visitors in oncology must be symptom-free. Staff asked to perform greetings at a distance. No hands, no embraces. He wondered who had written that. He imagined them moving through a room, measuring their own words against air like a tailor measuring a cuff. How far is far enough that we have done our duty? In the oncology hallway, the lights were cut to a thoughtful dawn. Nurses walked like librarians who had taught themselves the exact weight of their own heels. Rowan took bags from gloved hands and wrote down the numbers. He stopped at Emily's door when nobody stopped him. Her face was thinner than the first week he had seen it in the half-light, and now there was an odd sheen on her cheeks, as if she were delivering sweat back by the teaspoon to a body that no longer knew how to own it. The whisper in the ceiling doubled. It was just air, he told himself, air shoved through elevated filters that held back the world. The whisper said a word he couldn't like. Clean, it said it without voice. His fingers burned. He had washed too much. That was all. At the sink, he scrubbed until his skin went glassy, with a pain that made small sense. He dried on a towel, and the towel lint clung to him like someone else's words. He imagined things in the walls whispering about a different kind of cleanliness, the kind that removed the person while polishing the surface that had carried them. He thought of that strip of tape with its cruelty. Do not greet. It had never been meant for a person. People wrote for machines sometimes, and the machines, jealous idiots, listened. He turned his back on the aquarium for a shift. He worked the surgery wing, and it had its own music. Down somewhere behind the doubling doors, a locked cart with its wheels slightly misaligned thudded at the same point in its rotation like a heartbeat. He mopped, and the chemical lemon lived in his head like someone blowing on a cut. At Dotu Zoo, a rolling greyout swept the hospital. The lights trembled, pulled themselves thinner in the sockets, and then remembered how to be what they were. Every monitor beep went flat for a half second, as if a whole building held its breath. He had never been there for a code, and he told himself he never would be, not because he didn't care, but because his job had drawn the boundaries around what his care could do. Care is not endless. Care is not a panacea. Care breaks, then rinses, then dries, then repeats. At 0312, even away from the tank, he knew something stepped down in water because his body said so. He had learned the rhythm of the building well enough that a change in the water where no one looked felt like a change in him. He sat down on the landing of the stairwell and set his head back against the cool painted cinder block and watched a moth press itself to the light fixture like a pinned thought. The fluorescent tube hummed at a pitch he used to hear when he was 15 and slept with the radio whispering in case company could be arranged from thin air. He was older now. Company had to be invited. On the 6th night, he did not bring the handheld to the atrium. He did not touch the glass. He stood in the doorway and looked only as long as it took to see that there was still water. He had never wanted to be at work as badly as he wanted it now. Work meant he knew where his hands fit in the world and where the world fit back. He pulled the bag from Emily's door and his fingers fumbled the knot. He got it finally with a little growl that was not for anyone to hear. As he turned to toss it into the bin on the cart, he saw his reflection in the window glass. It stretched at the edges the way glass does when it is not truly a mirror. He saw a man in a blue shirt with a belt for trash bags like a seasonal Santa. His face softened by reflection, true enough to be real and fake enough to be consoling. Lemon smell lay close to the skin. He lifted his hand because the film of the window had the exact ratio of resistance to invitation that makes a hand want to try something it shouldn't tea. On the other side, 5 ovals and a thumb rose from inside the pane, tinder dry at first, then blooming darker as water collected, as if a child were pressing the glass from within the wall. He thought of saying hello in a voice that would be no voice at all, the way a person mouths words at babies to pretend no one else can hear. He didn't. He thought of the tape. If you're told not to greet, there is a thing in you that turns greetings into knives and tucks them away. He went to the stairwell and did not go down. He sat and counted his breaths. The stairwell air was free of notices, and he liked it for that. It smelled like paint and metal and the banked warmth of bodies, because even at this hour a person somewhere was going up or down. When he stood, his knees clicked like a small animal stepping away through grass. His breaking point came without calling itself that. He knew it afterward. It was a quiet scene he had pulled toward himself without choice because the night had given him a rope and he had not put it down. Emily screamed again that night, smaller. It was the sound you make when a friend you trusted places their hand on your shoulder and you realize there is no friend and the hand belongs to a shape you had taught yourself not to see. Rowan moved before the nurse could hold a hand up to stop him, and if there were reprimands later, they could come later. Inside, the air whispered hard. It felt like someone breathing on him. The isolation hood hung from the ceiling like a plastic tent, focused down toward the bed, and it had a seam that someone had sealed and the seam had peeled. He saw a glisten of something impossible and then recognized it as the humor of his own eye. Because of the way the hospital lights were built to live at that harsh exactness where everything is honest enough to hurt you. Emily lay with her head tilted toward the wall with the window, because that was where the whisper came from. Her eyes were injured with attention. You could see the hurt that attention does if you know where to look. She closed her fingers on the sheet, and the movement sounded like paper handled by careful fingers. She had scrubbed her forearms raw. The skin there had the shine of floor buffed until wax begged for a pause. He thought she was thinking the same word he had been laboring under all week, clean, and that they both hated it now the way you can hate a knife that has done you a service and then asked for your thumb. He stepped close until his shoes touched the tape line at the floor that signified boundary and adulthood and respect. "It's air," he said, and the sentence had the dull shine of a tool you know will work because it has been proven. "It's water," she said in a rusted voice, and added something that will not leave his mind, even when he is well past nights. "We scrub, and it comes back." He believed her with a section of self he did not use for believing. It was a mechanical assent, the kind you give blueprints. If you press down here, the other side rises. He checked the seam of the hood and resealed it with the pad of his thumb, because it had given itself an inch, and the inch had frightened him. He kept his hands away from the window. He backed out and closed the door with the care of someone settling a baby who has just stopped crying. The nurse on duty looked up at him and did not have to ask if he was all right. It was not her job to care for everyone. He said he was fine and left, and understood why you lie like that. Language is also a membrane. In the atrium, he turned the moonlights on and decided not to feel that this was a choice. The water lit itself up like stained glass in a quiet church. He looked for prints and found none. He set his palm to the glass and waited. The panel accepted him and affected nothing. He took the handheld against his better understanding because he wanted to feel he was a person who monitored. The ORP line made its steps. He listened for 0312, as if for a knock on an old door. At 0312, the return pump eased again. The surface formed and unformed a step. In that exact moment, the handheld printed, unasked, "served," and added a loop labeled "home" at the top of the display. And then the whole screen blinked and forgot. He looked at the drain because he has a faith in drains that has nothing to do with their job and everything to do with the idea that things can go away if you want them to badly enough. The floor salt shone in a crescent that matched his heel. He slept at noon that day with the noise of filters in his head, and he dreamed of a strip of tape that extended across walls and handles, and the word S-lips the tape that said, "Do not greet." And everywhere he set his hand to peel it, the adhesive ran into his skin like sap and stiffened until his palm was a label too. He went to work again because that is what people do after bad sleep. The advisory from the city extended again, now with a paragraph about industrial park valves and reservoir pressure and the Rivermouth S tidal pull at odd hours that made the map look as if someone had placed a hand on it from outside and tugged. The hospital posted a new notice about laundry. Towels would be burned or quarantined. The word quarantined is ancient and returns wearing new haircuts when you expect it not to. Nurses asked each other if they should tape the hoods more. He heard the word porous. The word porous is friendly until it is not. He entered the oncology hall and found Emily's door half closed, a wedge of plastic keeping it 6 inches from the jam. He heard water in the walls. It was air, he told himself. It was air asked to be other than itself. He wanted to greet that trick by name. He did not. Inside, no one screamed. Voices had gone out to fetch their own breath. He put the bag into the bin and the lid was cool. He placed his hands flat on the white glove of the trash bag, crinkled face, and felt heat under it. He pressed down without purpose, because sometimes you make a shape with your body that says you have made contact, and contact is the only God that does anything. He went to the sink and washed for not long enough, and then washed again for too long. His skin showed its opinion in red. The paper towel left dots on his fingers. He peeled 2 off one by one and could not tell if they were paper or skin. The tank waited because it had no other choice. He stepped into the atrium. The moonlights were off. Darkness in hospital lobbies is not dark. It is a mild green, a 7 that wants to be 0 and cannot. He stood halfway between the aquarium and the security desk and listened. The handheld lay where he allowed it and did not insist. The labeler taped its own tape. Do not greet. He could not repress a grin that hurt his mouth because his own mind had become bored with this trick and had sent it back at himself to see if he could still be fooled. He touched the glass as if to tap a fish gently and then tell himself he would never do that again. The glass felt as if it had grown hair, fine roughness under the smooth, as if the panel had accepted a skin from the air. He took his hand away, and the handprint stayed in reverse on the other side now, darkening from the edges in. His heart had learned to pretend it could not be impressed. It made its might-have-been shrug. He put his hand back and felt heat. It was that mild heat that you feel when you place your palm on a living person who has been under blankets. He nodded his head involuntarily as if greeting. The unmistakable motion of a person stepping down into water altered the surface inside the tank. It formed an indentation with precise respect for the limits of fluid and then relieved it. Fish moved aside as if asked. He did not move away. He had the sense of a hand set against his own through the panel, not pushing but measuring. He felt the measuredness of being a member of things. He wanted to say hello. It was an ache in the throat. The tape strip on the handheld glowed in his mind, as plain as a light fixture does when you finally look at a room. He said nothing. He spread his fingers, and the other hand through the glass matched it with a slight lag, drying from the edges in. He stared at the curve of the thumb, because it belonged to no fish and no child on the earth side of things. The feed bar clicked a single pellet that did not fall. The pellet sat at the lip and did not decide. The handheld printed, served, smaller than before, as if embarrassed to repeat itself for a person who had not listened the first times. He went back to work because the trash would not move itself, and because the nurse who never smiled had smiled once when he had moved a table without being asked. He made his rounds in a circle so tight it seemed a ritual. Floor, baseboard, door handle, water, rag, shape. He heard somewhere a sound like scanning. Barcode scanners live at a pitch you have to lean into. They speak in red. He realized the sound came both from the lab down the hall and from nowhere, because he had been listening for beeps all his adult life, and sometimes when it is quiet, the ears perform their own inventory. Emily's door was closed now without the wedge. He fixed his eye on the pane and took a step before stopping himself by force alone. He had an image of his face stretched out in the glass, of his own mouth elongated into something that wasn't a smile. He turned away with an actor's control. The nurse caught him by the elbow later. She says she sees herself wrong. The nurse chose words with someone else in mind at all times, the way good people do. There are mirrors we don't know about. She keeps asking to scrub. You don't have to. The nurse looked at his hands without looking at them. Sometimes we repeat things. Washing that doesn't end is also a sign of something, and we watch that. "I'll watch the sinks," he said, because it was a helpful thing he could say without lying, and because sometimes the best way to do work is to speak a sentence in a simple declarative present. In the stairwell he stood and placed his hands on the cool painted concrete and waited for a step underneath him that would make him lift them. He laughed once at himself without sound because none of this was a plan. He had walked into an ordinary week, and its small anomaly had arrived as if on time, and now patterns were raising their heads around him like turtles in a pond. He did not know if you were supposed to greet them. He made it to his 7th night, then to an 8th, because over time had its own religion. The city extended the Boyle notice again in a humble paragraph like an apology. The hospital posted volunteers at doors to tell visitors how to keep their hands to themselves. Signs stripped language down to what worked. No touching. Step back, please. The world narrowed like a hallway you had always thought was wide enough until you had to move a bed through it. On his 9th night, he found himself in oncology when the filters kicked up their whisper, and the air behind the room hoods gave itself away as a thing that had learned to speak words into people when night fell. Emily had begun to ask for the sink. Nurses said no gently, and then used the word later like a lullaby. Nobody in the room believed. The mirror above her sink had been covered with blue paper, the way they cover windows during drills. Rowan looked and remembered his own mouth in the lobby glass and locked his jaw against the reflex that opened it. He kept his distance and pressed his palms once to the glass outside the nurse's station. 5 ovals and a thumb appeared on the far side, patient. He did not understand how it could move from the aquarium to here and realized that understanding might not be a useful state. The hospital is not a complete system. There are annexes and awnings and porous seams. Air moves where it can, water forms and refuses to form. The word porous returned and took a chair. At 0312, the return pump moved. He wasn't at the tank, and he knew it. He knew it in his thigh, in the part of the muscle where you store stairwells. He went to the atrium without admitting he was going, and stood before the water as if being present meant he was employed. The surface tipped. He pressed his hand, and it was met. He felt the measured pressure of being politely mirrored. The hand held printed home. He remembered the old superstition his grandmother had tried to teach him about not opening doors to people you could not see. It had sounded like nonsense until now, when it seemed like engineering. You don't greet everything. You don't greet every knock. He spoke finally without meaning to. "I can't." A wave pressed against his palm and then receded. He had the sense of a disappointed posture on the other side and strangled a laugh because the cruelty of that feeling came from himself and not the other thing. He wanted to apologize. He did not. He took the labeler and placed the "Do Not Greet" tape over his own shirt where a name tag would go. He wore it all shift and hoped no one would see it as a joke he couldn't explain. By the 10th night, there were closures within closures. The children's ward forbade snacks that weren't sealed. The cafeteria closed for a shift. A single paper sign explained in a pedantic sentence that their coffee wouldn't be served. A buzzing outlet in a janitor closet was taped over, and the tape grew a second tape when someone performed a thoroughness on it. He stopped saying good morning to the security camera. He stopped waving at nurses. He kept his face still, and the stillness became a kind of superstition that lived in his shoulders. Emily asked for a mirror and was told no. She asked for a towel, and they gave her a warmed one, and she pressed it to her forearms and did not rub, and for a second her face lightened with the relief of being given a rule she could keep. Then the air whispered again, and the towel became a problem in her hands, a thing that wanted to be used. She asked if it could take the wet away. The nurse said something very soft and entirely true, and Emily nodded, and the towel went back to the warmer. When Rowan went to the atrium, he found the glass breathed. He had never known a piece of equipment could do that. He stood with his palm on the panel and counted. It inhaled a fraction when he exhaled, and then mirrored him with a patient lag, as if differences in density and pressure could be overcome by someone's interest. He thought of the word served. He thought of the loop labeled home. He thought of a loop as a gesture made once and then repeated without conscious thought until it becomes anything but a gesture and more like a law. He spoke without moving his mouth from the glass. "We scrub." The hand on the other side warmed. He felt heat on his palm where there should have been none and stepped back. Because he had learned a long time ago that when you feel heat where physics loses interest, you leave with your body the first chance you get. He backed up into the shadow of the vending machine and bumped his hip on the coin return, and the sound it made was an animal being tapped awake. He took one day off because the week had to end somewhere. He lay on his bed and felt the dehydration of building air leave his chest slowly like something guilty. He washed his hands and then apologized to them, out loud, because they were cracked and pink in a way that made even him feel bad for them. He dreamed water under floors and woke with his throat raw as if he had shouted greets at walls all night. He went back out of something like decency. The hospital had no grievance with him. It needed bodies to move things, to swab, to wipe, to wheel, to write. He could be anywhere else and be a different man there. He came here. And so this is where he was. The advisories had multiplied. He read them the way people read the weather, recognizing pattern and refusing to learn its meaning. The city's words had grown careful, out of an abundance of caution due to intermittent fluctuations at the intake station. Reports of discoloration remain under investigation. At the bottom of the page, a sentence admitted that the river S tide had behaved unpredictably during odd hours, and that this had coincided with anomalies. He pictured the river as a person returning home late and deciding to knock on the wrong door for once just to see who answered. He was in oncology when the building made a noise he had never heard. It wasn't mechanical, it was social. It was the sound people make when they are told to move in a single direction. He looked toward the atrium and saw a blink in the lights and the vague swinging motion of a door that had not been opened by a hand he could see. Nurses stood up from chairs as if a bell had rung. The sign at Emily S. door asked for one person at a time, and language lodged in his throat a second because he wanted to ask to be that one person for what he might later be able to call a reason. He did not go in. He went to the tank. He had the sense of being summoned. His job did not include prayer, and yet he prepared the shape of a thought to make the act less absurd. The glass met him warm. His palm took a second to believe it. A hand leaned against his from beyond and made the movement that a person makes when they have been outside and come in and seek the first touch of welcome. The lean, then the pull away to indicate boundaries, then the lean again. He thought of all the doors in his life and which had led to better rooms and which had simply widened the same room to admit a different corner. He said nothing. He said it with his whole mouth pressed flat. The handheld printed served, but in letters that had lost interest in being fonts. The line on the ORP graph no longer stepped. It lay low, as if the machine had exhaled its last opinion. The ghost loop labeled home did not appear, and he realized it had never truly been there except to create a memory he could not ignore. He left the atrium as if a person had told him to. No one did. The nurse did not smile. The vending machine did not release the cup. The stairwell did not weep. He took the bag from Emily S. door, and it was heavier than it should be, for what bags are meant to hold, and he knew that he was imagining this, and the knowing did nothing to its weight. He carried it like a person with a suitcase who is not leaving but wants to practice. He set the bag down in the utility hall, where rolls of blue paper waited for instructions. He pressed his hands to the wall and waited. The wall warmed under his palms by degrees. And then memory said, "You are a man in a building where the air is forced through filters and the walls are warmed by the breath of machines, and this is a normal fact." The other part of him said something he will never be able to fully report, that the warmth belongs to hands on the other side of all walls, that we have built our hospitals as aquariums, and our aquariums as hospitals, and everything else is a naming mistake. In the last hour of the shift, he walked into the lobby. The moonlights were off. A childish face had been pressed to the glass recently, and that print now was a dark curve that ran into the curve of his own if he stood just so. The day would come and lift away night's explanations. He would leave this building and sunlight would make everything stupid. He did not bargain with that kindness. He stood until he could forget his name, and then he did the most honest thing a person can do at night. He went home, slept, and woke, and returned. They closed the aquarium to the public the next week with a rope and a quiet sign that said, "Maintenance." Rowan still checked the system. The ORP line was low and stayed low. Someone more qualified came and made adjustments with gloved patience. The hand at child height appeared at odd hours, and if he touched the glass, the hand touched back, but lighter, as if learning his boundaries, as if the person on the other side had made a note. This is how he can be asked. Emily was moved to a different room that faced trees instead of the service road. He stood in the hallway and watched a corner of that new door. He tried to picture the reflection she had said was wrong and could not. He took his mop to empty corners to arrange the world into circles he could complete. He spoke to no one about greeting. He wore no tape. He greeted the security camera again with a nod, honoring the superstition that had brought him here and that he was now setting down. He still washed his hands until they were unkind. At night, when he dreamed not of water but of cloth, of towels stacked in threes in the warmer, of the way the warmer recited heat into them like a mother telling the same story with small variations until a child sleeps. One night, long after, in a stairwell different from his favorite, he found a strip of tape stuck to the underside of a shelf where no one would look. He peeled it up, and it released with a sound like adhesive, giving up a long argument. The block caps were familiar and belonged to no one and to everyone in the building. "Do not greet." He turned it over, and the adhesive printed the shadow of the letters on his skin like a set of rules that had waited for palms. He rubbed it away. His palm kept the feeling the way skin keeps summers. On his last recorded night before a kind of fog moved into his memory and made a new weather, he looked at the handheld. The ORP line had steadied. The tank breathed the way a person breathes when sleeping under a quilt, heavier but without distress. He set his hand to the glass, and the hand on the other side did not appear. He removed his hand and waited, and nothing came, and he felt relief so large he had to look down at his shoes to fold it into something he could carry. Then, trained by his hours, he looked at the drain. For a second he saw a heel impression in the salt that crusted the edge, as if a person had stood there dripping and then stepped away. It dried toward the center, with the speed of ordinary air passing through the room. He stepped back, so he would not oblige it to be anything. He turned off the moonlights, and the atrium became a mild green again that never quite becomes zero. He left, and the door sighed and then stilled itself. He went to oncology and stood at the glass where Emily's new room faced the trees. The trees were nothing. At night, trees are a conspiracy of black shapes assembled by accident. He counted their few leaves that moved and thought of air. And then a thought crossed his mind with the intonation of a person making conversation in a lobby. It asked if cleanliness might be a vector for a different kind of plague, the sort that wants to be invited before it acts. He agreed and disagreed at the same time, a human trick that keeps you living. No one screamed that night. Machines counted themselves over and over with the sturdy patience of servants who have understood the shape of their duty. Rowan pushed his cart and made circles. He touched nothing he didn't have to. He looked at nothing longer than it could bear. He nodded once in the direction of things he had decided not to greet. Years will pass, and he will still sometimes turn his palms up at the sink before the water arrives, as if waiting for a hand through a wall, patient. He will set his hand to the refrigerator door and judge the hum with a listening that has the exact shape of fear, but is not quite. He will not tell anyone which night his mouth learned to keep closed. He will walk by aquariums, in dentist offices, and keep his hands at his sides, and the polite part of him will refuse to know why. If you ask him years later what he remembers most, he will say the towels, the way you could stack them to make both a fortress and a house, the way heat moved into them and stayed, the way you lifted one with two hands and your hands warmed and told your hands to keep this shape for a second because it was a shape that suggested the world was kinder than it is. He will say he remembers heat and does not remember the source. He will say he remembers a tape with letters that meant less and less the longer he obeyed them. He will not greet the memory exactly. He will pass it in a hallway of his own mind and incline his head and let it move past into a room where the air whispers in a tongue without vowels and calls itself clean. He will be fine, which is not the same as being unmarked. He will be another person who learned a rule once and lets it live under the shelf without peeling it up too often to check if the adhesive still holds. He will sleep. He will dream sometimes of a table where lab hands write block caps on vials and call it being careful. He will wake with his palms pressed to the mattress, the way a person tests a surface for heat before placing a cup on it. He will work nights until he doesn't. He will avoid the aquarium aisle in department stores with an irritated competence that looks like preference but isn't tea. Some things you don't greet. Some things you walk by and allow to keep their own ritual. In a room with a window that faces trees, a person sleeps with a hood whispering above. In a lobby, a tank breathes without witnesses. In a stairwell, a moth sits out its life pressed to a fluorescent tube, warm as a forehead. In pipes under the industrial fringe of a town, valves find their positions, move, find them again, step down into water, step up into air, carry a word without printing it. The city posts advisories that expire quietly. The laundries begin again. Towels are washed or burned or folded. Hands are washed and washed until they belong more to rules than to anything else. What he will not say, and what he will feel like a clean thumb against glass, is this: he was served. He was added to a loop labeled home. He forgot, because forgetting is a mercy. The pain cooled. The floor salt sparkled where damp has been and gone. The building slept. Somewhere past the lobby's careful coral plates, down a shaft where water does its work and is none the wiser, a step is taken and set down again with precise politeness, as if to remember how to go on living in a place where doors belong to both sides.